Spheres. Excerpt 3. First, one must understand that within the bounds of the natural universe, worlds are governed by strict physical laws. However, the demonic anomaly corrupts and alters the very fabric of time and space. The demon's consciousness, like that of any sentient being, can be described as spherical. But upon contact with such a sphere, the effect becomes deconstructive to the bound laws of physics. As for the origin of these anomalies and the power they wield, it seems evident that they may well be the likely result of some metaphysical blunder of nature. The anomalies seem to spring forth from some accident in the processes of the universal mechanics, in the same way that mutations occur amongst the biological mechanics in nature. The resulting anomalous energy, after coming in contact with certain sentient consciousness, can then evolve into a representative entity. If the question were, how real are the realities created within or altered by demonic influence? The answer would be very real indeed. Chapter 2. The Book of the Skull. Kurt sat in the grass, on his coat, beneath a large maple tree, staring at a notebook which lay in his lap. Despite his personal promise to himself 2 nights ago to no longer dwell on the events of the college's past and the bizarre dream at the party, he had found himself writing notes on both subjects. Trying to convince himself that the werewolf in his dream had been a second-hand high-induced creation of his lonely, homesick mind turned out to be harder than he had imagined. Against all his better judgment, he had begun shadowing Cho Fan in an attempt to further his interactions with Angelica. For his own part, Cho seemed more than willing to almost piggyback Kurt everywhere he went, and seemed to be extremely amiable in allowing Kurt interactions with the girl. He had dispelled Kurt's questions of the manner of his relationship with Angel by explaining, "She's just a friend, dude." Angel had answered the same question with, "He's my bodyguard." "You're lucky you passed his criteria, or we'd never have met." "Is that why he waited so long before mentioning you?" Kurt had asked in disbelief. "He thinks it's his sacred duty to protect me. He must think I'm quite the delicate flower," she had laughed. That had been yesterday, right before she had invited him to a lecture by one of her favorite professors. "Look," she had said as she washed down a mouthful of extremely hot gumbo with cold beer as they sat in the corner booth at the Cafe Cajun. "If you really want to learn some interesting stuff about this school, you've got to go to one of Kira's lectures." "Who's Kira?" he asked, blowing a large spoonful, apparently unmindful of how dainty he looked as Angelica giggled mysteriously. "Professor Kira Bashmet. She's Russian. She actually teaches classical music, but she gives these awesome lectures on all kinds of things." "Other things? Like what?" "Like a lot of stuff. She came to study the library. Actually, something in the library." "What?" His interest was beyond piqued. "Meet me tomorrow underneath this big maple by the lecture halls at 8, and then you'll see." Then she had finished her last 2 bites, tipped back her beer, and left him biting the bit with curiosity. So here he had sat since 7, waiting. True to her word, Angelica came walking across the campus with her laptop case under one arm and one of the giant styrofoam coffee containers in the other. He knew that she had walked across town since she lived at least a mile away in a small rundown apartment building, even though she could have easily bought herself a house with what Kurt understood to be the small fortune still left of her inheritance. "Are you ready?" she asked, standing before him with the morning sun shining off of her black hair. "For a while now." "Let's go then." She began walking before he even got to his feet, and he was forced to sprint 3 steps to catch up. The college's lecture halls, like the other campus buildings, were far from mundane, and in design reminded Kurt of a large brick church building one might see in any southern community. They climbed the concrete steps and entered through the double glass doors into a simply decorated anteroom with a few simple furnishings and potted ferns in the corners. Once again, there were the ever-present objects of student art hanging on walls and seated on marble pedestals. Angel had mentioned that Kira Bashmet's lectures were extremely popular, and upon entering the theater-sized hall, they found the only seats left available in the very back. In the center of the room were the standard stage, a podium, and a large screen for slides. A projector was set up beside the podium on a plain table, on which was also a bottle of red wine and a glass and an ashtray. As he seated himself and placed his notebook on the small half-desk of the seat, Kurt wondered what he was to expect from the professor of which Angel spoke so highly. The general murmur of the room grew absolutely silent as the door to the side of the stage opened and a tall woman dressed in a black suit climbed the steps and walked to the podium, the clapping of her high heels the only sound audible. Kurt stared in amazement, as she was, in his opinion, the most outrightly intimidating woman he had ever seen. In her heels, she stood in the neighborhood of 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders made even more pronounced by the suit coat she wore like a military uniform. Her ash blonde hair was pulled into an immaculate ponytail, which streamed down her back to her waist. Her face was angular, as if chiseled from stone, and her eyes were the palest crystal blue nature could provide. She reached over to the wine bottle and filled the glass, her long, delicate fingers covered in various glittering rings of gold and silver. With the glass full, she withdrew a gleaming cigarette case from within her coat and lit a long black cigarette with a gold-colored filter. She took one deep drag and then carefully placed the cigarette in the ashtray, where it continued to issue wisps of smoke like incense. "Good morning, students." Her voice carried through the auditorium without any need of a sound system to enhance it. "I am glad to see you all here. For those of you who are new to our school this year, my name is Professor Kira Bashmet, and I am Professor of Musical Studies here at Mossborough. However, as you probably know, I am also hold a doctorate in anthropology and an MBA in theoretical physics. I am from Stalingrad, Russia, but I came here to study the subject of today's lecture 12 years ago." She paused to lift the glass of wine and took a considerably long drink before taking another puff from her cigarette and placing it back in the ashtray. She released a cloud of gray smoke before beginning a slow walk to the other side of the stage. "I am, of course, referring to one of the most famous objects contained in our wondrous library, the Book of the Skull." Kurt felt a chill run down his spine as he looked at Angel, who only smiled as she opened her laptop. "If you are unfamiliar with this obscure tome, then I hope to enlighten you as to its value and mystery." Kurt now saw that she held a remote in her hand, which she used to open the first slide in the projector. The room broke into whispers as a photo of a large leather-bound book with Russian lettering across its cover appeared on the screen. "Quiet, please. Now, this book that you see represented before you is one of the rarest of antique treasures known to the world of academia, and is also an irreplaceable piece of Russian occult history. At its printing, only 100 copies were produced, and of them only 13 have survived. Many were located and destroyed by Tsarist Russia, and many more by the communist regime of Stalin's rule. Its contents were considered threatening by both regimes, and now, what few copies remain are jealously guarded by private collectors. There have been no known reprints or translations. 13 years ago, it was brought to my attention that a single copy was available for study here in this unlikely little town. I have spent 12 years studying the book's content and how it came to be here. Today, I am prepared to share with you what little information I have gleaned from my studies. Kira paused with forced patience and allowed the whispering of her audience to die down. She was looking up thoughtfully at the image on the screen before she continued. The origin of the book is no mystery, but merely a page out of Russia's history. As you should all well know, the Russian people have long been repressed, even before the advent of the communist revolution under which the last Tsar and his family were assassinated. The Tsars had long held the country in an iron grip of ignorance and poverty. It could even be said that the Middle Ages lasted longer in Russia than in any country of its size in the world, a fact that many would attribute to the actual country being landlocked, thereby inhibiting foreign trade and the advent of any industrial revolution. As of 1877, there was no Russian middle class, but only the peasants and nobility. At this time, there existed a subversive group known as the Narodnaya Volya, who was actively working to end the rule of the Tsars and introduced communism as the new government. There was in Moscow a printer and journalist by the name of Maxiamano Maskadov, who was not only writing and printing in underground communist newsletter, but was also holding secret meetings of the Narodnaya Volya, in which he was actively recruiting new members by virtue of his gift for public speaking. We are told by history that he was possessed of a magnetic personality and a fierce love of his country and family. Here's the only known picture of Maximano, taken with his wife, Anfisa, and their 6 children. Kira once more clicked the remote in her hand, and a worn black and white photograph appeared on the screen. The man who stood presiding proudly over his children was tall and broad-shouldered, with pronounced cheekbones and a hooked nose. He wore a fur winter cap on his head, and his face was covered in a long, thin black beard. His children are presented from oldest to youngest. Their names were Maxim, Vadim, Artemy, and the 2 girls, Natasya and Vladislava, and then his youngest son, Afanasy. It would be only 1 year after this picture was taken that Maximano would be arrested and sentenced to life in a Siberian labor camp known as Kara Katorga. The records of this time spent at the camp are lost to us. All we know is that by 1879, Maximano would be put to death by a firing squad at Kara. Before his death, he was granted a final request, which he made to the pastor who resided at the camp, to be returned to his family for burial. Despite the resistance of authorities, his request was granted, and his body was shipped home by train to Moscow. Here is where our real story begins. Kira, now standing by the table, took another long drink from her wine glass and lit another cigarette as the other had burned to ashes. She clicked the remote again, and another aged photograph appeared of a young man who greatly resembled Maximano appeared. He was tall and well-built, but with lighter hair and a clean-shaven, hawkish face. His clothing was of a later era, and he was seen sitting posed at a desk with a pen in hand, as if writing on the papers before him. This is Afanasy Maskadov, the youngest son of Maximano at age 22. He is considered the unofficial author of the Book of the Skull. I say unofficial because, according to his own statements, the book was dictated to him by another source. This source, he claimed, was the skull of his dead father. Once again the professor paused, but the room was silent. All listened intently. Maximaно's body was shipped home and buried in a local cemetery where it would remain undisturbed for 10 years. It would be at this time, soon after his 14th birthday, that Afanasi would begin having disturbing dreams accompanied by fevers and hallucinations. The most common of these visions would be the voice of his dead father compelling him to dig up his grave and remove the skull from the body. It would be in the year 1889 that he and his older brother Artemy would do exactly that. Kira now snubbed the cigarette and turned to the audience. Does anyone have any questions at this point? A female student dressed in a flannel shirt and a long multicolored dress raised her hand. Yes, Natalie, Kira said, smiling. So, Artemy just went along with the desecration of his father's grave and body? It may help you to understand if you were made aware that by this time, Afanasi had already demonstrated a number of strange talents. Following his fevers, he was known to have predicted several natural disasters, and was even known to have led a local search party in the finding of a small child who was lost outside the city during a family trip. It was said that Afanasi could on occasion read minds and identify criminals. At the point of the removal of the skull from the grave, Artemy was a firm believer in his brother's special abilities. The perpetrators of the grave robbery would not be known until Afanasi would write of it himself after the publication of the book. You see, he took the skull, and in his own words, "It would never be silent while in my presence." It seemed that Maximano continued a discourse with his son from beyond the grave for a great many years to come, and the vast amount of this conversation was recorded by Afanasi to later be printed as the book of which we speak. It would only be after the completion of the book that Afanasi would gain any peace from the ongoing dialogue of the mystical object. These periods of relief were signified by the skull's many disappearances. Afanasi wrote, "I will go to my study and find the table where it sits bare. At first, I searched and questioned my family of its whereabouts, but they all pled ignorance of its location. Days would pass, and then there it would be, staring at me in silence." So, where did Afanasi think the skull was going? Asked a tall, skeletally thin boy in a black sleeveless shirt, his face covered in an assortment of piercings and linking chains. Kira seemed not to notice that he had spoken without raising his hand. Well, Mitchell, he really had no idea. But he did desperately want to find out before the actual publication of the book he had just finished compiling. That was when he sought the advice of an old friend of the family. Is anyone here familiar with the name Archip Helena Zulkin? Countess A.H. Zulkin, the medium and writer. It was Angel who spoke this time, her voice carrying from the back of the room like a clap of some thunder. She was the founding member of the Philomansic Ministry. Very good, Angelica. Kira smiled warmly as the picture of the screen switched to another photograph of a middle-aged, moon-faced woman with enormous pale-colored eyes that Kurt felt could be no other color than blue. The woman's chin rested in her hand as she gazed mystically at them all, as if from across the void of time. She was also a correspondent of Maxiamano Maskatev. It was to her that Afanasi turned for answers. He found her living in England, as she was at that time the toast of London. That is before she was accused of being a charlatan a year later and banned from working in England by the Queen herself. Afanasi personally brought her the skull and left it at her apartments, requesting only that she write to him of her experiences within the month. That was in December of 1898. We do know that she did as Afanasi requested, and that she did, in fact, have much to say about the skull. However, we do not know what she wrote, since those letters have yet to be released by the Maskadov estate. We do know that while Akhip had the skull, it made one last disappearance before remaining lost for 34 years. Where did it show up then? The flannel-shirted girl with long hair asked. Where else but Poland, in the house of Afanasi's sister Nastasia. Now, Nastasia Faustin war broke out, and the skull was more or less lost to history. There have been rumors of its appearance at various sites across Europe, and many museums have claimed to own the one true skull. But most of these claims have been proven to be rumors and mistakes. What does the book say? It was a large, athletic-appearing boy with a shaved head and a full red beard who asked. From his expression, he was spellbound by Kira's lecture. I have, over the course of my studies, produced a full translation. If you are interested, you can peruse certain excerpts that I have posted on the school website. I can tell you now, to briefly summarize, that it is an extensive explanation of a complex pseudo-scientific philosophical belief system. It alternates between references to shamanistic religion and the physics of some unheard-of universal overview. It deals with mystical powers, prophecy, and the afterlife. I believe that Madame Zulkan described it as an occult scripture. You all will have to judge for yourselves. As for me, it is not my place to label or categorize the work, but only to study it. That will be all for today. I wish you all a good day and look forward to seeing you all this year. With that, Professor Bashmet smiled, bowed, and walked off the stage as brief applause filled the room. What did you think? Angelica asked, closing her laptop as the students filed out, lost in a babble of conversations. I want to see it, Kurt answered. After the lecture, Kurt wasted no time in hurriedly rushing across the octagon to the back steps of the library. He was halted by a sudden sharp pull at his sleeve as Angelica grabbed him with surprising strength. Kurt! It's not on display. You will have to clear it with the dean. I haven't even met the dean yet. I only just saw her for the first time 2 days ago. Isn't she German? Her name is Agnes Abendroth, and I'm sure she'll be more than happy to let you see the book with Kira's approval, but you'll have to wait until I can talk to her. Angel was smiling, her hand still resting on his arm, the warm electric buzz he remembered from the party causing the hairs on the back of his neck to rise up. Hey, tonight, I'm having a get-together out the house. Oh, God, not another party. No, not at all. Just a few people and a campfire. We're going to tell ghost stories. Joe's coming, so you can tag along with him. If you don't want beer, then you'll have to bring your own drinks. I'll grab a 6-pack of Fruity Fizz on the way. Isn't that stuff, like, outlawed in some states? Yeah. You can't even get it in Ohio after all the lawsuits over the caffeine content. I couldn't believe they sold it here in town. You're such a trip. I'll see you tonight. That had been around 10 in the morning, and now after another winding car ride into the bayou, Kurt once more found himself at the Love Mansion. This time, however, he sat on a comfortable hay bale, chugging fruity fizz cola and watching as the sun slowly began its descent over the distant green trees as Cho, Rick, and Christoph, both literature majors, stacked firewood into a massive pile inside of a somewhat monolithic circle of stones around which they would sit. This they saturated with lighter fluid before settling back and awaiting Angel's reappearance from the house where she had vanished almost an hour before. When she emerged through the front doors, Kurt felt a cold chill as he saw that she wore a long dress and a white blouse which brought her resemblance to the painting of Maxine Love to an unsettling and obvious reality. "What do you think?" she said, twirling in her very gypsy-like dance, but Kurt, just noticing that she was also wearing strange silver jewelry that glinted on her ear and at her wrists. "Where'd you pick up the costume, Esmeralda?" Cho chided as he removed a match from inside a sliding box in his hand. "These are my mother's clothes," she said proudly as she flourished her hands in a grandiose display. All her wardrobes were still full. I picked out the ones I liked and had them cleaned. The jewelry is hers too. It was in a safety deposit box at the bank." "She must have really liked silver," Kurt commented quietly. "Yeah, I think I do too," Angel said, smiling. "Okay, I guess everyone's here. Rick, Christoph, Sherry, Darla, this is Kurt. He'll be sitting in tonight. Kurt, since this is your first time, you can just listen. Guys, I was thinking since Kurt's new to the areas, tonight's stories will be local fare. So, we're going to tell actual ghost stories," Kurt said, sipping some fruity fizz. "They can be, but just about any urban legend or particularly dark or scary event will do." Angel was speaking as she settled comfortably between Joe and Kurt in the circle. "We can either wait until it's dark, or if someone's got something good, they can start." "Is good," Christoph said excitedly. His accent was thick Austrian, and his dark eyes flashed intensely in the firelight. "I am always talking to locals about the town. I talk to old people in restaurants, and they tell me stories about the swamp. Also, many things about Engel's family, but such things are but rumors." "It's okay, Christoph. If the stories are good, go ahead. Stories are about all I've got, about this house." Angel sounded interested already. "And don't forget the money," Joe reminded with a playful nudge. "Yeah, and that. Anyway, continue, Christoph. I've heard most of it anyway. It's a matter of public knowledge." Yes. Well, public knowledge is rarely the truth. However, it is a very good story to tell here. This couple, they arrive here in 30s, and the town is very poor, so they say they came from Holland, but they do not have the Dutch way of speaking. They are very young and very rich. The locals do not trust them, but they like their money very much. These two are but teenagers, but they come with trucks full of loaded crates and buy a small house in town. It is here they live while they build this mansion, here in the woods. The townspeople, they decide that these Van Dulevers are devil worshippers, and are very happy when they move to the mansion. They hire 3 different groups of contractors to build their house, and all only work for a short time before they are sent away and other group brought in. This way, no one has any clear idea what the house will be when it is done. In time, they hire people from town to work at this house, and these servants are very well paid, as they are not allowed to speak of what goes on there. The town becomes wealthy because of these people, and they are called the Loves for short. They begin having children, but people rarely see them. In time, the locals suspect bad things from the Loves, but they like their money, and they say nothing. The man, he is said to have secret places on the coast, and the fishermen see boats being unloaded all the time. And there are cars that drive out to the house late at night, and the locals think they are running bootleg whiskey and smuggled goods. But the Loves, they pay very well, and the locals do not mind. In the 50s, the Loves close off their house to all but a very few servants. People in town almost forget the house is there. There are 3 servants left by the 60s, and they begin to talk. And as soon as they do, they are fired. What did they say? Kurt asked as the last rays of the sun disappeared over the distant forest. They say there are no more Loves, but one. The youngest girl, who is all alone. From then on, she is seen in town only 3 times or so. It is during this time that the library is built. Groceries are brought to the gate, and the girl receives them and pays, but no one ever sets foot on the grounds. The last time they see her is 1980, and she is with child. She sees the only lawyer here in town, pays him some extraordinary amount, and is never heard from again. This is how we know is engagement. And that's when the real legend starts, Darla said, cracking an open can of beer from one of the 3 coolers placed strategically around the group. The real stories. Kurt was overwhelmed with a strange feeling creeping in his mind. I got this one. Rick, a tall, gangly metalhead with dark hair and a goatee, said, smiling dazedly over his 5th beer. Kurt reminded himself that Cho said the rough-looking boy was a brilliant student as well as guitar player. First, there are the snakes. Don't remind me, Angel said, rolling her eyes. It took a fortune to get them all removed from the house. They must have been breeding here for decades. Exactly. And the locals blame your family. Their evil brought them from every corner of the bayou, made them bigger and deadlier than any normal cottonmouth could possibly get without the taint of the devil. Hunters couldn't even get within a mile of the mansion grounds in the summer because the ground and the bushes were just covered with them. The story is that one in particular was possessed by Satan himself and lived in the woods west of the house. By the cemetery? Sherry said, smiling mysteriously. What cemetery? Kurt said, leaning forward, his curiosity now unquenchable. Wow, you are new, Rick laughed, slapping his leg and reaching for the nearest cooler. Okay, you've got to see that to believe it, so we won't ruin it for you with pale description. It's creepy as hell, Angel said with a soft smile. However, if it's haunted locations you seek, then where you sit is by far the most well-known in the area. Cho had taken on the persona of a tour guide, standing by the fire and presenting the mansion behind them like a game show hostess revealing the grand prize. Why, everyone in Mossborough knows that the Love family has never really left their estate, for their ghosts are regularly reported to be roaming the halls of their until recently ruined home. What about it, Angel? Have you seen any family members roaming the halls? Sherry asked, the flames reflected in her large, thick glasses. No, Angel replied, as she thoughtfully stroked her long hair as if it were a pet draped across her shoulder. But I never spend the night out here. The closest I ever came was that last party, and I was only alone for like a half hour before I left. I mean, this house is scary. You guys didn't see it before it was cleaned up. It was like a mausoleum filled with snakes and weeds. All the furniture was still sitting covered in mold and dust. Guys, there are vaults underneath the house that have been bricked up since God knows when. The contractor told me that they could open them up if I wanted, but there was a chance that the rooms, tunnels, or whatever is behind them are flooded. Exactly, Christoph exclaimed, his black hair falling over his eyes carelessly as he leapt forward with excitement. Secret tunnels that lead out to the beach and cemetery that your grandfather was using to smuggle stolen, priceless art and books that eventually your mother would secretly donate to the library. I know, it makes sense, Angel said as she threw up her hands in surrender. They were criminals, And devil worshippers. I get it. I don't know about devil worshippers, Rick intervened with a surprisingly serious tone, but I am guessing that they had some very curious religious beliefs. They may have just been members of some small European sect of paganism or even a bizarre denomination of Christianity. The books in the house span a huge variety of religions and science both. I think they were probably just really well educated and way beyond the people who were living in these parts culturally at the time. Anyone who was not a hardcore Southern Baptist might be considered a Satanist in Depression era Mississippi. But the locals have seen ghost lights in the house at night, Joe added, with his back now turned to the group as he studied the house and lit a small pin joint. They used to see what looked like a candlelight passing the windows. That was just local kids who would climb the wall and dare each other to jump into the grounds. Christoph, too, was now studying the house as if a thought were being passed from person to person along with Cho's joint. The kids, they would never jump for fear of the ghosts, but I think they should have feared the snakes more. Let's spend the night, Cho said, clapping his hands and turning to face the group. Awesome idea, Rick said with smoke pouring from his mouth and nostrils. Why not? Angel said as she shrugged her shoulders, as if resigned to the path the night was taking. No one passed the joint to her since she did not smoke, and Cho had already previously warned the group not to invite Kurt into said activities, on pain of a boring lecture from his new acquaintance. Darla was giggling excitedly and bouncing up and down as if she had won a vacation. We can hang out and play cards or something until the ghosts show up. Well, I also got a wine and port that was still in the cellar from way back when. Angel was now smiling and threw her empty beer can in the fire. Oh, this night's just getting better and better, Cho shouted, slapping Kurt on the back in adulation. Kurt had to admit to himself that although he was the only sober person in the downstairs study, which they had chosen for their activities, he was still having an amazingly good time. The Fruity Fizz's absurd stimulant kick had sent him into a nervous state of euphoria as they played poker at the large reading table underneath a small antique electric chandelier. No one was paying any real attention to the game as the conversation kept drifting off into various subjects and stories. The only real silent or awkward moment had been Kurt's when, in the middle of another batch of urban legends, he had posed the question, "Are there any werewolf stories in this area?" Silence fell over the table, and Kurt was momentarily embarrassed before he realized that they were actually deep in concentration as they attempted to recall any such relevant stories. "There's the skunk ape," Brick offered as he swished brownish burgundy port in a large, clear glass. A little further north, they've got the Dogman stories, Sherry said, her eyes heavy-lidded. That's more of Midwestern thing, Darla commented. There are many werewolf stories in Austria, but you know this, of course. Wow, no werewolves in Mississippi, Joe said, chuckling. Why, man? You dig werewolves? Rick said conversationally, even though he seemed on the verge of unconsciousness. Sort of, I guess. It just seems like there's stories about everything else. The Choctaw have folklore about a deer man, Darla offered, sounding almost completely inebriated. They call him Keshahatapolo? Keshahatapolo? I'm sure he takes the whole hunting thing a little personally, Angel said, interrupting as she left the table and laid down on the couch, her glass balanced on her stomach. Where are the Choctaw, anyway? Kurt asked, thinking of the cab driver. Farther north, in Neshoba County, they've got a resort and casinos on their reservation. Yeah, but they live all over. You know, the Choctaw believe in ghosts too, Darla said, sharpening a bit as the conversation moved more into her realm of expertise. Of course, a lot of them are old beliefs or lost, but a lot of it was recorded by explorers, thankfully. So, what were their ghost stories like? Joe said, also leaving the table and planting himself beside a large chair by the fireplace, which crackled with low, dim fire. They believed that every man has an outside shadow self that stayed behind after you died. It wasn't a particularly pleasant thing either. Most Native American cultures had a pretty scary view of the world if you compare it to our modern ideals. Darla was now standing and looking at the bookshelves as she spoke. You could draw parallels to just about every primitive world culture. You're definitely right about that, Joe interrupted as he lit the small stub of the remaining joint. Back in South Korea, it's mostly Buddhist, but before that, there was a whole religion of shamanism. I mean, look at the Phoenix and the Dragon. The Phoenix and the Dragon, Kurt said, sitting in the chair across from Joe, but leaning forward as he eagerly listened. Sure. In Korea, you've got this yin and yang, dragon and phoenix, that represent male destruction and female creation. A kind of good and evil situation, but slightly more complicated. Then you've got all these Native American stories of thunderbirds and, of course, the horned serpent. Darla took the roach from Joe as she continued through a stifled cough. All these Indian tribes have these stories of a great horned serpent with magical powers. The Choctaw call it Sinti Lapida, and it has a big glowing diamond between its horns. If you can trick, defeat, or befriend Sinti Lapida, you can gain the power of the gem. There's also stories about little forest people called the Bopoli. Oh, don't forget about Nalusachito, Cherry said from where she sat on the table. You study this stuff too? Kurt was feeling very uneducated. Not really, but my mom is part Choctaw. Angel is too, I think. There's no way to prove that, Angel said, her eyes closed as she drifted on the verge of sleep. Yeah, but you definitely have some kind of native heritage, and it would make sense that your mom was with a Choctaw. Maybe you're related to Choctaw Steve, Rick joked as he began a game of solitaire at the table. Choctaw Steve, Kurt said, feeling the uneasy shiver returning. Yeah, the cab driver in town, Joe said, laughing. He's actually pretty cool, but weird as hell. Okay, wait a minute, Kurt said, wanting to redirect the conversation. You said another word. Nalusachito, Cherry said. If you let yourself have hopeless thoughts or evil fantasies, then Nalusachito can enter you and eat your soul. Well, if that's not encouragement to keep some PMA, then I don't know what is, Joe said, closing his eyes and resting his chin on the side of the chair. PMA? Kurt asked, confused. Positive mental attitude, Angel answered, giggling as she fell asleep. An hour had passed, and Kurt sat in the quiet dark room listening to the soft pop of the fire and the gentle breaths and snores of his companions. Angel lay on the sofa, Joe slept in the chair, and the remaining four were curled respectively distant in silent sleeping balls on the thick carpet before the fireplace like preschoolers on their mats at nap time. Kurt's eyes were dry and heavy, but a prodigious amount of fruity fizz was still pumping through his bloodstream, and sleep seemed a far-off hope. He was staring at the low blue flames when he noticed that their flicker now carried a green hue unlike any he had ever witnessed before. The emerald light was washing over him as he lay on the beach as a warm tide swelled and receded from the ocean. He laughed to himself and looked over to see if anyone else was awake to notice, but their slumber seemed, if possible, even deeper than before. This too he found amusing as he looked into the darkness of the room. There were shapes then moving behind the furniture like quiet, secretive shadows, barely making a sound. His eyes were wide with mirth and wonder as he caught a glimpse of a naked human-like thigh in the dancing green light as its possessor scurried behind the couch where Angel lay. "Oh no!" he giggled ridiculously. "Oh, it's happening again." Taking a deep breath and swallowing the urge to roll on the floor in hysterical good humor, he stood and walked to the edge of the light. Are you guys Bopoli?" he said, trying to sound friendly. His words were met with whispers from the corners of the study. Hey! You don't have to hide from me, guys. I'm cool." He watched with glee as a single shadow began to creep closer, accompanied by several other forms hiding cautiously behind it. It stepped into the light, and Kurt was amazed to be staring at a naked male humanoid creature no more than 2 feet in height. His skin was dark tan like a Native American, and his hair, which was white as snow, hung down over his shoulders like a cloak. The being regarded him with enormous dark eyes that seemed to have no whites or redness to speak of. The being was slightly stooped in posture, and his facial features were preternaturally large, with a wide mouth that was turned in a warm but somewhat unnerving smile. Bopoli? Kurt said, pointing at the being, who nodded and held a large, gnarled hand to its chest. "Dreamwalk?" Kurt questioned, raising his own hands in the universal sign for confusion. The being again nodded in agreement as it pointed to the door. "You want me to go out there?" Once more it nodded, still smiling with great amusement. Knowing instinctively that he had no choice, Kurt walked to the door of the room, and carefully opening the large oak door, he stepped out into the main room to find all the lights and even the great chandelier lit and shining bright than he had ever seen before. His gaze immediately traveled to the dining room, where the table was covered in dozens of candles and open bottles of wine. He approached carefully as he became aware of the sound of laughter and clanking glasses. What he walked in on was a scene that vaguely reminded him of a bizarre version of the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. Seated at the gargantuan table was an absurd number of Bopoli, who sat 2 to a chair as they drank and ate what looked like the entire contents of the kitchen and pantry. At the head of the table, to his left, by the great open windows of the hall, was a large, deer-headed man who drank directly from a bottle of cognac and seemed involved in some strange conversation with the small forest men. At the other end of the table by the kitchen was a huge form covered completely in a long, dirty, dark violet shroud, its face covered by a low, drooping cowl. The shrouded one was silent and unmoving in contrast to the other guests at the party. Kurt suddenly felt a tug on his pant leg and glanced down to see the Bopoli with whom he had conversed in the study, staring up at him from the side. The being was shaking his head solemnly as if to say, "This is not for you." Then the forest man raised his arm and pointed to the front doors. "I have to go outside?" A question that the Bopoli answered with a serious nod. "Hey, you guys wouldn't hurt me, would you? I mean, I love the woods. I don't even litter." The Bopoli only looked up, smiling slightly, and gave the same gesture of confusion Kurt had shown him moments before. Shaking his head at the small being, he resigned himself to follow through, and he walked to the door and opened it. As soon as the door was cracked only an inch, it blasted open with the furious pressure of a frightening and powerful wind that blew in from the night. Kurt held his arms over his head as the force threatened to knock him from his feet. Struggling, he pushed through the entrance, and peering into the night, he saw a vicious and surreal storm had erupted outside. Lightning flashed in multicolored streaks from huge fuming storm clouds. In between red, green, and blue bursts of branching strikes, there was only black, abysmal darkness that weighed down on all its oppressive, stifling omnipotence. The trees in the far distance curled and writhed as if in agony from some unseen tormentor. Rain poured down in torrents that washed over the bricks of the courtyard in a developing flood. Kurt was relieved to find that the forest man still stood bravely at his side, pointing into the night. Kurt squinted and gazed to the spot the Bopoli indicated and could see the distinct form of a man standing still in the storm 20 yards away. He could make out no features except that the shape appeared to have a hood like that of a sweatshirt or jacket pulled over his head. "Who is it?" Kurt yelled over the rain and booming thunder. The Bopoli looked up, and to Kurt's utter shock, spoke one word in a low, masculine voice that seemed at odds with his size. "Nulusachito," the wizened being said with a foreboding tone. Kurt was suddenly filled with dread and horror as the sublime euphoria of the dreamwalk spiraled into a twisted, paranoid terror. He looked down once more to the small being who was now pointing off at the distant horizon. Kurt focused his sight on a violet light that was sailing through the clouds like a lavender beacon. "What now, a UFO?" he called out, bringing a smile to the lined, weathered face of the Bopoli. It shook its head, and making a grandiose gesture with its hands, said another word. "Chirokaka!" As the light grew nearer, Kurt realized that it was gigantic and moving within its own radiance. As it soared from the clouds and crossed over their heads, Kurt could see that it clearly was a glowing, purple, fiery bird the size of a jet airplane, flying through the storm, unaffected by the wind or lightning. Just as the sight filled him with awe and peace, the entire world melted around him into an oblivion of stagnant night. The steps beneath him disintegrated, and he was now dropped into a viscous mire of thick, warm water. Enveloped in dark fluid, he fought to the surface of whatever pool into which he had fallen. As his head broke through, he gasped and spit mouthfuls of foul swamp water. He swam in place, looking around frantically for familiar terrain. He found that all was familiar, yet horribly and nightmarishly altered. He was still in the courtyard, but now all was hidden in the murk of a vast body of black water. The storm was gone, but he could not see the sky or stars. He tread water and searched desperately for his companion, who was nowhere to be found. What he could see were shapes moving in the water beneath the top branches of submerged trees and floating sludge-like islands of algae. "Oh God, no, please!" he screamed as he realized that he was surrounded by hundreds of black, swimming snakes. He thrashed and coughed as he fought to swim away, only to find he was completely encircled by the swirling masses of various water snakes. He saw the mansion behind him half sunken and decrepit, with black, empty windows like the rotted sockets of a corpse. Then, just as he thought he would lose the very fragile grip he held on his own sanity, there came a light in the distance underneath the water. And as the light grew nearer, he was aware of the snakes were parting to allow its progression towards him. Like the glowing bird's illumination was green, but much less brilliant. The sickly, pale glow was filling the water around him as he felt himself succumbing to a vile nausea that threatened to weaken him into drowning. As he watched it grow to a halt in the same vicinity as where he had viewed the other figure previously, then he watched as the light began to rise up from beneath the water and break the surface like a massive whale breaching at sea. First, he saw two horns, like those of a ram, sitting on each side of the glowing light, a gem emerging from the swirling water. As it rose up above him, he recognized the rest of its form as that of a great prehistoric serpent with thick, shining, ancient green scales, its body the size of the oldest sequoia. Kurt, in all his bewildered terror, then felt a presence at his side. He turned in the water and saw a woman, visible only from the shoulders up, but a scarce foot away from him, not swimming, but floating still and upright in the water. He studied her profile, but could not see her face as it was covered in long, wet black hair. Then, as she slowly turned, a scream froze in his chest when he saw the face bathed in the green glow of the serpent's gem. He knew her by her portrait and her resemblance to her daughter, but was still struck dumb by her eyes, which glowed with a radiance of their own in a clear, white illumination. "Maxine," he whispered, as he realized that her form was translucent and dim. She stared at him only for a moment before her cold, bloodless lips parted, and she spoke. "It's time for you to remember." The water water began to churn and swirl into a whirlpool as she drifted away, and he was pulled down into the depth of the force below. Now there was no more water. He was only falling farther into a void of bottomless, sightless, empty air. In his mind, he began to see images fighting to be realized in the emptiness. He saw Angel older and laying in an empty lot, bleeding as she reached out to him. He saw a tall, dark shadow moving down a corridor accompanied by the giant shadow of some beast, and he saw a teenage boy twisted in death to resemble a horrid snake, gripping him with clawed hands as others crawled into the morning light behind. In the folds of his nightmare, Kurt held his head and screamed as he had never before. "I'm dead. I'm dead. I'm dead." "Kurt, wake up!" Joe said, shaking his sleeping friend from where he lay, writhing and yelling in his sleep. "Buddy, it's just another dream. Wake up!" He shook Kurt frantically as they stood around him in a circle with mouths agape. He has night terrors," Joe explained to the others as Angel moved closer and grabbed Kurt's hands. Immediately, Kurt's tormented struggle ceased and his body fell limp in the cushions as his eyes flickered open and looked upon Angel's beautiful shining eyes glistening with tears of compassion. "You're alive," he whispered hoarsely as he returned her grip, holding her soft hands with overwhelming relief. "And so are you, buddy," Joe said, wiping nervous sweat from his eyes. "Kurt, are you okay?" Angel said, a tear streaking down her cheek, her sympathy flooding every pore of his skin with warm electric pulses of calm peace. "You kept on saying that you were dead." Kurt sat breathing heavily and gazing around at the concerned faces of the people he had just met the night before. As his mind threw together the volley of images, still clear and compelling, he answered, "Yeah, I have night terrors."